On Monday, February 27, 1995, the Chisholm family's phone rang in the middle of the night, startling Johnny and Joe Gary from their deep sleep in Rock Hill, South Carolina, over 400 miles from Washington, D.C. Johnny noted the time as close to 1:30 a.m., an hour when no one would dare make a call in the South unless it was an emergency. Joe Gary answered the phone, but the voice was loud enough for Johnny to hear. A man identified himself as Detective Lewis Douglas with the Metropolitan Police Department in Washington, D.C. To their utter shock, he claimed that their 25-year-old daughter Dana was in jail following a sting operation at the Omni Hotel, arrested on charges related to sex work. This allegation seemed completely inconsistent with their daughter's character. Dana worked an office job in the city, and her only real trouble had been with her parents shortly after high school, when she briefly associated with the wrong crowd and experimented with drugs. That period was years in the past, and there had never been any arrests for sex work. Beyond the content of the call, Johnny found the caller's demeanor disturbing. Retired Detective Jim Trainum, who later reviewed Dana's case as part of his cold case work at MPD, recalled Johnny's description of how the caller seemed oddly excited, even mentioning that he expected to receive a promotion. The man explained that Dana would be arraigned and released at some point during the day, then reassured them not to worry because she was fine and suggested they call in the morning. Although the conversation's tone was bizarre, the caller provided a phone number for them to call later, which lent some credibility to the call. The family could only wait anxiously until they hopefully heard from their daughter later that day. When morning arrived without any word from Dana, Johnny decided to call the number he had been given. To his surprise, the line connected to MPD, but when he asked for Detective Douglas and was transferred, the real detective's response immediately filled Johnny with dread. The actual Detective Douglas was completely puzzled about the situation. He had not called the family and had no idea what Johnny was discussing. Furthermore, a detective in the 2nd District would not typically conduct prostitution stings, as that would fall under a completely different unit's jurisdiction. The entire call had been fabricated. When the real Detective Douglas learned about the previous call, he asked where Dana worked. Johnny hesitated to provide this information, concerned that if this was all an elaborate prank, he might inadvertently cause trouble for his daughter at the Hudson Institute, the political think tank where she worked as a secretary. Detective Douglas pressed Johnny with language that seemed strange, asking whether he wanted to find his daughter. This phrasing troubled Johnny because he had not indicated that he was looking for her, only that he was worried about her being detained. Desperate for answers, Johnny eventually provided his daughter's work address. No missing persons report was filed or case opened on Dana at this time. However, Detective Douglas assured Johnny that he would investigate and call back. He decided to visit the house where Dana lived to check on her. When he received no answer at the door, he left his business card. Douglas never called Johnny back to report his lack of success in contacting Dana. He may have been waiting to hear something back from her, or possibly assumed the entire situation was meaningless. After all, the house was located in an exceptionally nice neighborhood where it would be easy to believe that serious crimes did not occur. Retired MPD Captain Michael Farish described the area, explaining that Argyle Terrace was upscale, part of what was called the Gold Coast. The location was so prestigious that jumping the fence in the backyard would lead to an estate owned by the Rockefeller family. The Gold Coast was designated as an enclave in the northwest corner of D.C. for Black professionals and intellectuals. Farish had previously patrolled that area and could attest to the extremely low crime rates there, since cell phones were not yet common in 1995. When Johnny never heard back from Detective Douglas, he decided to call Dana's employer directly to determine what was happening. Perhaps this was all a misunderstanding, and she was at the office working normally on Monday. However, calling her office only increased Johnny's concern. He recalled that her boss was rude, stating that Dana had not shown up for work that morning before quickly hanging up. While Dana apparently had a history of arriving late or occasionally skipping work, perhaps the response reflected frustration with her attendance pattern. Annoyed by the apparent apathy, Johnny called back and spoke to one of Dana's female co-workers, a friend who was respectful but confirmed the same information. Dana had not appeared at work and had not called to explain her absence. While people at work seemed to be overlooking her absence, At least one person in D.C. was concerned enough about Dana to investigate further. Her landlord, who lived upstairs with her teenage son, while Dana occupied the entire basement floor with her own separate entrance, found the business card that Detective Douglas had left. Since detective cards did not typically appear randomly, the landlord suspected something was wrong and called Douglas. She learned that no one had been able to contact Dana, which troubled her because Dana's car was parked in the driveway. She decided to conduct her own investigation after hanging up. First, she checked to see if Dana would answer the basement door, thinking she might not have heard Detective Douglas's earlier knock. When she received no response, the landlord used her own key to enter the basement area. This decision revealed why no one had heard from Dana. Back in South Carolina, approximately 24 hours after receiving the mysterious midnight call, the Chisholm family's phone startled them awake again. This time, dispatch was asking them to go to their front door where 2 county deputies were waiting. Johnny opened the door, and one deputy handed him a number for the D.C. police. When he called, authorities finally delivered the horrific news that their daughter Dana had been murdered. The Chisholms never traveled to D.C. and have never visited to this day, finding the prospect too overwhelming to bear. Instead, they arranged for a family member already living in the area to confirm their daughter's identity on their behalf. This arrangement spared them from witnessing the disturbing crime scene. Dana was discovered in the hallway, nude with a cord wrapped around her neck. She was positioned sitting against the bedroom door with the cord wrapped around the door handle, and her arms crossed in front of her. She had been strangled with a piece of phone cord that had been cut, with part of it still lying on her bed. Detectives also observed ligature marks indicating that her hands or wrists had been bound at some point. The crime scene appeared to be selectively ransacked rather than displaying the random destruction typical of burglary scenes. The positioning suggested that the perpetrator knew what they were seeking and targeted specific areas. Police believed the killer had taken something that day, but had also left something behind. An ominous message written on the calendar in the hallway. The message referred to Dana in vulgar terms, but concluded with the particularly disturbing phrase, promising to return, specifically addressing MPD. Then Sergeant Michael Farish responded to the crime scene that day. Working in what was known as the murder capital during his 30s, he had witnessed many terrible crimes, but this sexually explicit note, ending with the threat to return, remained permanently imprinted in his mind, along with the fear he felt when reading that final line. The message raised alarming questions about whether this indicated more victims would follow, whether this represented the first identified victim in a potential series of linked cases, or whether this was the inaugural crime of someone planning additional attacks. The department clearly faced a killer who enjoyed psychological games. Not only had he left a pointed message for police, but the medical examiner determined Dana's likely time of death as late evening on February 26th, meaning she was probably deceased hours before her parents received that mysterious call. Fake Detective Douglas. Investigators determined that the killer had not made the call from Dana's house because they eventually traced it to a payphone near Interstate 395, positioned where someone could easily access routes to Virginia or Maryland. However, they believed the killer had likely remained at her apartment after she died. Dana's landlord remembered hearing someone taking a long shower at some point during the evening of Dana's murder. At the time, she probably assumed it was Dana, but she likely suspected even then that Dana was not alone in her basement apartment. Around 6:00 p.m., she had noticed an unknown car parked in the driveway directly behind Dana's vehicle. Although she could not remember specific details about the car, not considering anything unusual at the time since she had not been paying particular attention. The landlord and her teenage son were home around the time Dana was believed to have been killed, but they heard nothing concerning. There were no loud arguments, sounds of struggle, or screams for help, though it was a substantial house where sounds might not carry easily. Determining who Dana was with that evening should have been straightforward. Detectives discovered that she maintained a detailed date book and diary that provided comprehensive documentation of her activities. She also had a caller ID box, which in 1995 represented cutting-edge technology that police could use to identify who she had been in contact with leading up to her death. However, this advantage was negated by the killer's actions. The landline system would display incoming phone numbers on the caller ID box, And while these could be deleted, in this case, the perpetrator had taken the actual device. The killer most likely removed the box because their number would have appeared in the recent call list, possibly as the most recent contact. Detectives interviewed one of Dana's friends who had been visiting her at Dana's residence on Saturday afternoon, leaving around 5:30 p.m. And this friend observed something significant. While they were together planning to go out, Dana changed her mind about their plans. During this time, Dana received multiple phone calls that she chose not to answer after checking the caller ID. Along with the caller ID box, at least 3 other items were known to be missing. The first was Dana's apartment key, which had seemingly been taken by her killer, probably to lock the door upon departure. Strangely, the killer did not retain the key permanently. A reporter filming news coverage outside her residence found the key in the street, called detectives over to examine it, and it was confirmed to be Dana's apartment key. The killer's decision to lock the door after leaving seemed significant. The key had apparently been removed from a key ring, raising questions about why he felt compelled to take this action, and why he removed it from the ring. Once he no longer needed it, he would have wanted to dispose of it immediately because possession of the key could link him to Dana, something he would want to avoid. The other 2 missing items were never recovered: her most recent datebook and diary. This disappearance led Detective Trainum to theorize that someone was attempting to erase any evidence that they had ever existed in Dana's life. However, there was something left behind that could not be erased. Dana's autopsy revealed that she was 4 weeks pregnant. Johnny told reporters that the family had been unaware of the pregnancy, but in hindsight, he remembered something significant. Dana had recently called to inform him that she would be making a trip home soon because she had something important to tell him. There was speculation that she had recently learned about the pregnancy, possibly before receiving medical confirmation, and had informed the person responsible. It was theorized that Dana typically used protection with her partners, but perhaps had developed a more personal relationship with someone, and had not used contraception, resulting in the pregnancy. Dana had definitely known about the pregnancy because approximately 1 week before her murder, she had confided the news to a coworker. The revelation occurred when this friend caught Dana crying at the office, suggesting that this discovery was unplanned and distressing to her, at least in that vulnerable moment. It remains unclear whether Dana told this friend or anyone else who she believed might be the father. Both Trainum and Farish could not recall whether this friend or any other person interviewed by detectives had offered a possible name, noting that such a comment would have been memorable enough to leave a lasting impression. Present-day D.C. Police Commander Kevin Kentish indicated that he could not comment on whether Dana had provided her friend with a potential father's name, since this person would obviously be considered a suspect. Determining who Dana was with before her death became police's highest priority, and fortunately, Dana had potentially left them their first list of potential suspects. She had been documenting the various men she had been seeing, and inside her apartment, police found notes containing names and phone numbers. What her job, parents, and many close friends were unaware of was that Dana had numerous boyfriends and was working part-time as an escort. She advertised for dates through local weekly newspapers seeking companionship and phone lines where people could exchange information. According to her friends and some clients who were interviewed, she would request money indirectly. Typically, if she became involved with a client and they had sexual relations, she would hint that she could use financial assistance, and they would often pay her. Some online sources suggested this constituted extortion, but both Trainum and Farish emphasized that none of the men interviewed described her approach as blatant or malicious. Farish characterized it as Dana making suggestions rather than explicit demands. Her approach involved playing on sympathy or appealing to clients' better nature, rather than making direct threats or blackmail attempts. There were no indications that she explicitly demanded cash or threatened to contact spouses. Her method was more subtle, involving stories about sudden roommate departures or other financial hardships. One concerning aspect of her escort work, which friends had warned her about, was that Dana would become emotionally involved with some clients and begin viewing them as friends. This emotional attachment likely contributed to her vulnerability and potentially played a role in her death. While it was important not to engage in victim blaming, understanding victimology was crucial for identifying potential suspects. By examining what was occurring in the victim's life, and looking at timelines and relationships. The men Dana encountered varied considerably, including businessmen, flashy individuals she met at clubs, and both single and married clients. According to Farish, there was one particular type that seemed to attract her most: law enforcement officers. Several law enforcement officers were identified and interviewed, whether they were local or federal agents who had relationships with her, ranging from formal dates with sexual encounters to casual meetings and hookups. Among all the law enforcement personnel identified and interviewed, Farish believed at least 2 were officers currently working for MPD at the time. The investigation approach with law enforcement personnel was direct and thorough. Officers were told they could either come in voluntarily to talk, or investigators would contact their homes to arrange interviews. Personal matters such as extramarital affairs were considered between the officers, their consciences, and their spouses, not police business. The law enforcement officers they identified appeared confident during interviews, and they were subjected to intense scrutiny. Investigators examined them carefully to ensure they had complete stories and attempted to find inconsistencies to avoid potential embarrassment later. There was another MPD officer not necessarily on Dana's documented list who may have been familiar with her: Detective Lewis Douglas himself. Although he initially had not remembered any connection to Dana, after her body was found and he came to the homicide office to provide a statement, he realized he had actually met her previously. Approximately 1 week before Dana's murder, items had been stolen at the Hudson Institute where she worked, and Douglas had handled that case, actually speaking with Dana during his investigation. He denied any contact with her beyond that professional interaction. According to Douglas, when he returned to the station after her body was discovered, he reviewed the complainant files and found her name as someone he had interviewed or taken a report from. He claimed to have no memory of her until reviewing those files. Dana maintained a book filled with business cards that was discovered during the search of her residence. The theory emerged that her killer could have found the card Detective Douglas would have given Dana in that book, taken it to the payphone that night, and used the name Detective Douglas when calling the Chisholms. While this explanation might account for the use of Douglas's name, it did not explain the motivation for making the call in the first place. Was it intended to provide her parents with a reason why she would not be in contact, perhaps to delay anyone realizing Dana was dead? Or was it purely intended to torment them? In March, when the phone at the homicide office rang, then Sergeant Michael Farish received an answer to that question. Someone called asking specifically for him, and as he answered, he realized the caller possessed knowledge about the case. Although his initial reaction was that colleagues might be playing a prank, the caller began discussing the case, and Dana specifically, though not in great detail. As squad sergeant of the homicide unit at that time, Farish had naturally become the primary spokesperson for Dana's case, with many media updates delivered through him, making it logical that this caller would ask for him specifically. The conversation lasted only about a minute to 90 seconds, but the caller said enough for Farish to consider that this might be legitimate contact. The voice was unfamiliar, and when the caller suggested that Farish knew how to reach him, Farish clarified that he did not. When asked for a name, the caller questioned why he would provide his real name. Farish insisted he needed something to call him, stating he was tired of addressing him as Sir, so the caller provided a name. Although the voice was similar to the one who had called the Chisholms, somewhat raspy, possibly belonging to a man in his 30s or 40s, this time he did not identify himself as Detective Douglas. Instead, he used the name of a Marvel character. The specific character name has been withheld because Farish believes it could be important evidence to preserve. When the case was initially discussed publicly, Farish was concerned that this detail might have been revealed, but he wanted people to know about the Marvel connection because after all this time, he believes this information might stand out to someone with relevant information. Perhaps the caller chose this specific Marvel superhero for a particular reason. Farish hoped the caller would contact him again, as he called 2 or 3 additional times, always requesting to speak specifically with Farish. Sometimes he would call during shifts when Farish was not working, and Farish would return to find message slips indicating he had been called by this particular name. The department lacked caller ID, call tracing, or trap and trace capabilities, so Farish installed an induction coil on his desk phone, essentially a suction cup with a microphone that attached to the receiver's back side, connected by wire to an old-fashioned tape recorder. Whenever he was at his desk, he would hit record and answer the phone in case it was the caller. Unfortunately, the caller never contacted him when he was actually at his desk. The caller maintained no set schedule and would never remain on the phone long enough for extended conversation. He refused to be placed on hold, apparently concerned about phone tracing despite Farish's explanations that the D.C. Police Department used dial phones and lacked such technology. The caller did not believe these limitations. Authorities could not trace these calls, though they determined that the incoming calls were local. Farish described the caller as sounding intelligent, not genius level, but smart and emotionally controlled. The caller never directly admitted to killing Dana, but the implication was clearly present. In one of the few calls where he made contact with Farish, he claimed to know why Dana was murdered, attributing it to her lifestyle of going to clubs and sleeping with multiple men. He wanted Farish to publicize this information to the media. After consulting with behavioral analysis experts at Quantico, Farish decided to go public with more information about Dana, but he painted a picture completely opposite to what the caller had described. He portrayed her as an all-American girl, the cheerleader type who sang in the choir and was the kind of person you would bring home to meet your parents. This strategy appeared effective, as it provoked a response from the caller. After a brief hiatus, the man called again, announcing that he was back in town and willing to meet face-to-face with Farish. Farish recalled receiving the call while wearing a trench coat due to rainy, chilly weather. The caller provided a location in southeast D.C. off Minnesota Avenue and instructed him to meet there. Farish grabbed his coat and radio and rushed out, not even informing other unit members of his departure, only indicating he could be reached by radio if needed. He drove to the location in an unmarked cruiser, though such vehicles were easily recognizable to experienced criminals. Farish sat in the rain, drinking coffee and smoking cigarettes, watching every car and person that passed by, hoping that if the caller approached with violent intentions, he would at least see him coming. The case of Dana Chisholm remains one of the most haunting unsolved murders in Washington, D.C. Nearly 30 years after her death, the killer's bold taunting of law enforcement and his apparent confidence that he would never be caught continues to disturb investigators. The perpetrator demonstrated sophisticated planning and psychological manipulation, from the timing of his calls to his careful removal of evidence that could link him to Dana. The investigation revealed the complex layers of Dana's life, including her work as an escort and her relationships with various men, particularly those in law enforcement. Her pregnancy added another tragic dimension to the case, suggesting she may have been planning to share life-changing news with her family when her life was cut short. The killer's phone calls to both Dana's family and to Sergeant Farish demonstrate a disturbing pattern of psychological torment that extends beyond the murder itself. His use of a Marvel character's name and his specific request to speak with Farish suggest either familiarity with police procedures or careful research into the investigation's personnel. Despite the passage of nearly 3 decades, the case remains active, with investigators hoping that advances in forensic technology or new information from the public might finally provide the breakthrough needed to identify Dana's killer. The missing caller ID box, diary, and datebook represent crucial evidence that might have immediately solved the case, highlighting the perpetrator's awareness of what could incriminate him. The investigation into Dana Chisholm's murder stands as a testament to both the complexity of modern criminal investigation and the lasting impact of violent crime on families and communities. Until our killer is brought to justice, Dana's case serves as a reminder that some predators are capable of extraordinary cunning and cruelty, but also that dedicated investigators never stop seeking the truth, no matter how much time passes.